Welcome to Two Trick Pony, a twice-monthly podcast where we explore all the ways that people have found and cultivated their second tricks, from food writing to fencing and everything in between. We're your hosts. I'm Melissa Betters.
And I'm Claire Ma, and we thank you for joining us. Each week, we invite guests onto the show who have broken away from the expectations of their training, education, or CV to find fulfilling hobbies or even entirely new careers.
We take a look at how cultivating a multifaceted self can lead you to community, connection, and confidence.
This week, we're very excited to have Maryam Jillani as our guest on the show. Currently based in Washington, D.C., Maryam has lived in 5 countries and works on international development and education initiatives in Asia, Africa, and the U.S. She's also the author of the critically acclaimed cookbook Pakistan, the first cookbook on Pakistani cuisine that places recipes in their cultural and historical context. And she's just wrapped up her book tour this summer.
Before we get to our interview with Maryam, we want to give our listeners just a brief history of food writing.
Food writing can encompass recipes, memoirs, travelogues, or even poetry and fiction. It includes food criticism, journalism, and history. But in all these cases, the art of food writing treats food as an important cultural phenomenon, often as a lens for larger themes about people, politics, society, and nature.
As you'll hear in our interview today, our guest is the author of a groundbreaking cookbook on Pakistani cuisine and an exemplar of this flavor of food journalism. Writing about food has a long history, perhaps even as long as the history of the written word. There is no way that we can do it any justice here, so we'll provide just a taste of its rich history before turning to our interview today. Looking far back, religious stories and folktales give us an idea of what people ate in the past, and also what food meant to the people who prepared and shared these meals. In many ways, food is an integral part of the human experience, and we've been documenting its meaning from the beginning.
The term food writing, however, is relatively contemporary. It came into the mainstream in the 1990s, even though some of the most famous examples of food writing come from earlier times. Jean-Anselme Brillant-Savarin, a French lawyer, wrote The Physiology of Taste, or Meditations on Transcendental Gastronomy, in 1825, which is widely regarded as a classic in food writing. You may know the phrase, "Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are." It comes from Brillant-Savarin's famous book. Another famous example, this time from fiction, comes from Marcel Proust's passage in À la recherche du temps perdu, or In Search of Lost Time, about the memories evoked from the taste of sipping tea and eating a madeleine. For listeners who know me, I went to Smith College, and our college yearbook is called The Madeleine. It's well suited for a college where tea is still a tradition and nostalgia is always in supply.
Looking at a cookbook, you can see elements of technological transformation. Very early cookbooks were made to record recipes and train chefs, such as those who served European royalty. The development of movable type and the printing press increased literacy rates, allowing such books about food and recipes to move from a luxury good into the mainstream.
Spices also became more accessible to the middle classes over time, and the development of standardization in measurement meant that amount in recipes could be more precise, no longer guided by the hand of our ancestors.
Cookbooks proliferated with widespread literacy and industrial publishing. Many cookbooks focus on food preparation, but they can also include guidance on how to take care of a kitchen or attend to accidents, like minor knife cuts, oil fires, and mistakes. They can also change people's minds, as Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking arguably did by making infamously complicated French cuisine accessible to the home cook.
Our guest today is also having a major impact in the food world by bringing the diversity of Pakistani cuisine to mainstream audiences in the United States. Listeners, we're so excited for you to hear our conversation with Maryam Jillani, International Development Consultant and published author of the cookbook titled Pakistan.
So welcome, Maryam, to Two Trick Pony. We are really excited to have you here today.
Yeah, so for our listeners, can you give a brief introduction of who you are and what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. So I am a Pakistan-born food writer, researcher, and development practitioner. I recently came out with my first cookbook, Pakistan. It was released this March. I also do a lot of food reporting for various publications, ranging from Condé Nast Traveler to Food 52. And I also am a development consultant. So I have had like about 12 years of experience managing education programs overseas. And I, consult with various development organizations to work on business development strategy and technical writing.
Congratulations, Maryam, for your new book. You're just coming off of a nationwide book tour for the Cookbook Pakistan, which for our listeners is a groundbreaking treatment of Pakistan's cuisine with recipes placed in political, social, and historical context. And we're really interested in this, given your background in, you mentioned you have 12 years of experience on the development side, but how did you get into food writing?
So, there's like multiple layers to this. So one is that there was the part about, that I was always like, I did have a creative side to me. And while I, with my work in international development, I really care about social impact and I care about working with like diverse groups of people in diverse settings. And development hit all three boxes, but, my creative side was still quite unfulfilled. And after like a few years, I did feel like I was just like like a cog in the machine. I didn't feel like I was sort of really making an impact, a physical impact, because, with development programs, one, they're highly bureaucratic. Two, you don't really see the impact of any project or any sort of like intervention in like 10 to 12 years. And so there was a part of me that just wanted to feel like I was like sort of moving a needle while also engaging like different parts of my brain. But in 2016, I got back into photography and I also started really actively engaging with the restaurant scene in Washington, D.C. It was a new home and I felt it was a cool way of engaging with the city outside of just work. As many people know, Washington, D.C. is very work-centric. And I felt I wasn't getting to know it as a city outside of just sort of like all these big organizations outside of the federal government. And while I was engaging with the food scene here, I realized, and also I was trying to learn to cook, I realized there was a marked absence of Pakistani food, both from the restaurant side and also like on the internet. And so just as like kind of like a creative side project, I started the website Pakistan Eats. And then later when I moved to Juarez, Mexico in 2017, I realized I also wanted to start doing food reporting, which is sort of more like journalistic form of covering food. By starting the blog, I got to engage with food in sort of a visual way, like I got to engage in storytelling. And with food reporting, it was like I remember doing this one piece for Taste, which was Young Chefs of Juarez. It was kind of like my first formal reporting assignment. Juarez was my new home. I was like about a year in and I felt that there was like all these like cool restaurants that were opening up that were started by these young chefs. And once I had my first interview and I got into these really deep, engaging conversations with these young chefs, I just felt so alive and I felt a real sense of purpose. And again, like the parts of the brain that I felt had become numb after working in development for so many years, it sort of came alive. And it was kind of like an aha moment, which I was like, oh, I should do this in a sustained basis. And my editor actually at that time, Matt Rothbard, who I'm always be grateful for, he really encouraged me to start thinking about a book.
You write in the book, and you just mentioned that you noticed that there was a lack of cookbooks that featured Pakistani food and Pakistani recipes that really resonated with you, and that you felt reflected the diversity of cuisine in Pakistan. But I think it's an interesting question about why and how you decided that you wanted to do this, that this was a niche that you felt you wanted to fill. And really, what was your goal in taking on this project yourself?
That's a really good question. And, as on one level, I don't have a culinary arts background. And even my family, I think nobody would consider themselves like a foodie. But I think this is where my development background did come into play. Because there were a few food blogs, there were some, people coming on television and but I just felt that they were only presenting recipes that were reflective of their own background or like of a certain class in Pakistan. And because of my big background in development, my interest in anthropology, I like really care about diversity, about representation, about, presenting in a more like nuanced historical understanding of Pakistan. And so that's one of the reasons why I was like, like, oh, this could be my value add. So even though I don't come from a formal culinary arts background training, the story that I can tell about Pakistani food might be a lot more layered, might be a bit richer. I was taking kind of that perspective in development, which is, we try to be very consultative. We try to like take into the account of a lot of different communities. We want to make sure that there's like, that we're not excluding anyone. We're sort of taking into account power dynamics. So I wanted to bring some of those principles and values that I took from my development work and sort of apply it in the book, which is why the acknowledgement section in the book is so long. And even when I was sort of developing a recipe list, I was trying to take all these factors into account.
It almost does this book a disservice to just call it a cookbook. The essays that you write, they're just amazing. They're really rich. They're really layered. And as you said, you draw from a variety of disciplines, your anthropology background, but reading these essays, you also draw from political history, ethnic relations, geopolitics, even geography in some cases, and how that informs, what cuisine is made in which regions. With such a wide undertaking, what kinds of sources did you consult to inform this part of your writing?
Do you want to know about the resources that I drew from to like source information for the book on how to sort of guide myself as like a food writer?
Yeah, I think both Melissa and I are researchers, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper about the actual logistics of how you did this. There's a fieldwork component, obviously, in the book, but it's also so interdisciplinary and how you apply the knowledge that you are bringing from both fieldwork and also from your international development background. We wanted to understand, if someone else wanted to embark on a project like this, what would they need to do? What would they need to know? And who would they need to consult?
That's a really good question. And, honestly, I wish that because the project happened within like a fairly short period of time, I think that there will be some gaps in rigor. And there was also sort of a distinction that it is ultimately a commercial project. I think when you're publishing a cookbook, they're much more interested in the fact that, hey, does the story resonate? Does it read easily? Do the recipes work? So it's really up to me to decide, how do I want to present the essays? I think a lot of my sort of inspiration came from actually journalism. I was reading Declan Walsh's 9 Lives of Pakistan. It's one of my favorite books about a city as Maximum City. I really enjoy books by journalists when they do sort of deep dives, because I do feel that it is interdisciplinary. They draw upon what you mentioned, like political economy, anthropology, but they're presenting it in a format that ordinary people can understand, right? It's still like kind of a story, and which is why I've sort of in the essays I've inserted myself. And of telling it from a first person perspective. So I think, going back to your questions, I do think that I was heavily, heavily inspired by the work of journalists, long form journalists and long form essays. And that influenced how I want to tell these stories about the people and, of course, the food. I think that in Pakistan, I sort of pursued my bachelor's in social science from Lahore University of Management Sciences, and a lot of the kind of my coursework, we delved a lot into power dynamics and sort of how different ethnicities were represented in Pakistan, how it manifests itself in the economics of the country, the politics of the country, the role of the military. And obviously that was something that it was like my undergrad training that kind of had some of these frameworks that were sort of already baked in. So I was super cognizant of the fact that there were certain provinces that were highly underrepresented and that they frequently get erased out of the cultural conversation. Because of my training, academic training, I was also deeply skeptical of the idea of Pakistan as just a Muslim state. As I was sort of drafting my fieldwork plan, it sort of played into it. So, of course, there was the general practical considerations too, the fact that I had to do my fieldwork, like the advance hit my bank account and Ramzan was going to start. So there were very practical considerations about how, I did contract a travel logistics firm. I sort of helped them. And I was like, listen, I want to cover all the 4 provinces. I want to cover the northern areas. I want to try to get as many communities as possible. So they did provide some inputs, and they were like, okay, logistically, this would make sense. And I did some references too, right? I think there has been a couple of books by Pakistani scholars on Pakistani food. It's much more of kind of almost a listicle, which is if you want to break Pakistan. So I kind of use some resources to just sort of break down the provinces, communities within them, the communities within major urban centers. And so there was like kind of an ongoing list, what dishes I can source from those. And then kind of like the general matrix was like, okay, I want to cover these communities, and how that's going to flow into the recipe list itself, that was a different process, right? Because again, as I mentioned, it was a commercial cookbook. It wasn't just supposed to be like kind of like just a broadly like here is all of Pakistani food. I also had to balance that with representation, making sure that, you know, we're telling a nuanced story about Pakistan with the fact that you want to include recipes that people will want to cook. You want to include recipes that the diaspora is going to be looking for. And so I was kind of like, you know, just not highly unscientific, but it was very like, okay, each recipe has to meet at least like, is it like a weeknight, easy weeknight dish? Is it representative? Are people going to look for it? Is it like classic? So I did kind of had my own sort of, I wanted the book to be sort of well balanced a little bit. And ultimately, yeah, it's a book that I want people to read, but also particularly for outsiders, I wanted to be a book that they also cooked from.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your field work and thinking about moments that really stick with you.
I mean, I think there were so many moments that were really special to me, and that like I was kind of one of those, I would tear up because I realized how important the work was. I think it was like Karachi is like a major urban center. It's the biggest city in Pakistan. It's also one of the biggest food cities. But the food that keeps being highlighted from the city is one of migrant communities, so communities that have come from states like UP, Bihar, or like cities like Delhi. But actually the Karachi area also has like a indigenous coastal community, and that food never gets any attention, even though it's a really delightful, bright, fresh cuisine. And so I was lucky that one of my first kitchen visits was to the home of like a fisher folk, you know, activist, Fatma. And yeah, her and her sisters made this beautiful, you know, really fresh meal of prawn pulao, like this gorgeous fish soup, and there was like raita. And, you know, we just sat on the ground and like finished that meal and, you know, complaining about the government. And they were like doing a little like sister sort of, you know, kind of like giving each other a little bit of a hard time, roasting each other a little bit. But it was a really lovely meal. And I think immediately that showcased how important, you know, like how dishes like that never really make it to print or on digital media. But I think overall, what I did, the city that I got the most emotional was probably Quetta. I was there for a very short period of time, but I think because Balochistan has always been, you know, it's just it's an impoverished province, even though it's the largest and it's the largest like provider of natural gas in the country. It's been like in the throes of a insurgency, so there is like sort of tension between the military and sort of the insurgent group there that are advocating for great autonomy of the province. Because of that, a lot of, forget tourists, even like domestically, Pakistanis don't travel to Balochistan at all. And so once I visited there, you kind of like, and it was my first time in the city, first time meeting with diverse Baloch groups, I realized how rich the history of the province was, how different their food was. I mean, I tried a couple of dishes in Islamabad, but there's only like, it's like commercial bestsellers that will sort of make it. But I didn't realize how deep Pakistani cuisine's connection was to Iranian food, how close it was to Afghan food. And I think I got really emotional because all I felt was that these people, all these home cooks, restaurant cooks, they just wanted to feel seen. They wanted to be seen as people, not just like, you know, like as the subject of like political instability or economically impoverished. This was an opportunity for just tell them their own cultural story about how powerful and rich and deep their culture runs, how delicious their food is, and just to be seen as like regular people with some, you know, the way the culture worth celebrating. And I think that was just it was overall a very touching like stop during my field work.
No, and that really does come through in the cookbook, you know, all of the various people that you thank at the end of the acknowledgments and all of the different stories that you share. It was clearly quite an experience. You write that you visited 40 kitchens in 16 villages across 4 provinces. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty daunting. So I'm particularly really curious. You know, during that time, you mentioned a bit of the logistics, right? You had a travel agency. You mentioned just how inspiring and eye-opening it was to go to these regions that you may have not have been to before. But was there any point during these travels where you felt either some challenge or some doubt about like, what am I doing? Am I in over my head? When that happened, how did you stay motivated?
I mean, of course, and not all visits were equal, right? I mean, this was like during like a 6-week kind of chaotic trip. Like you can try to plan things as far enough in advance, but it was also just, like I said, I didn't have a long time to sort of plan, and not everything. It's also Pakistan and the global south, things sort of operate at their own pace. Plans were changing every day. Some of the visits were being decided just a few hours in advance. And on one level, of course, and I think Pakistan's a very vocal culture. So I was getting a lot of intel, which is like, you're doing it wrong. I can't believe you didn't do this. And why are you doing that? That's not even that important. So there's a lot of external noise that I think with any kind of creative project you're going to get. And I think that, of course, like, I'm also a first-time cookbook author, right? So it's not like I was going in super confident, like, I've got this. This was a very new project. It was very self-directed. And so I think there was a lot of doubts, and I just had to sort of carve out, like at the end of the day, just carve out like some time for myself, think through. And I know always trust my gut, but also just sort of being like, okay, can this be remedied in another way? There were some cities where I wasn't happy with the kitchen visits at all. I feel like some of the dishes like that were being presented were not the kind that I was looking for. Like in Peshawar, I felt like I did maybe multiple kitchen visits and all the cooks made the same thing. Even though that wasn't representative of their own family history, I just felt like it's the oldest city in South Asia. And then by the end of the trip, I was like, oh, is this all I've got? And so, yeah, there was definitely like huge moments of doubt. And then I was hoping that I would be able to remedy that by adding other cities. But because of weather and transportation, you couldn't. Like, I still missed out huge parts of the province. And so there was definitely like parts of the trip that, there was a lot of doubt where I was like, oh, I wish I'd done this differently. And yeah, but I think it's also one of those things when you're working with a large network of people, you have to like take into account and just sort of be a little bit kinder to yourself and, do the best that you can.
What do you think people tend to misunderstand about food writing? And what's something that you wish that people knew, especially in writing a cookbook?
I think that... And this is interesting because this sort of like tension is happening within the food writing world as well, right? So I think obviously conventionally, I think people, and I think that's also content that sells, which is like you going to restaurants, commenting about the food, or like sharing a recipe, and then you're going in detail about how the recipe tastes, or sort of delving into like much more the sensory aspects of it, really heavy focus on restaurant writing. Ultimately, I do feel majority of the readership still looks to food writing as that, right? Like, where should we eat? What should we eat? Why should we cook this? But I think that personally for me, what made food writing is, and there was like a few, food writers early on in 2016, 2017, when I read their essays, even if they were just telling their own story, they were connecting it to something broader, I thought that was really powerful. Of course, it takes longer to read. It's not utilitarian. It's much more. And so I thought that was what I found interesting. And I feel there is scope for that. Over time, I think that what I wish people would understand is that food can also be used as a lens to understand society. And I do think that people are coming around. And I think what's been nice to see that particularly among the Gen Zers, I feel like my sort of reporting or this book has sort of also made them realize that, hey, you can actually look and understand Pakistan through this lens of food, because normally we're always just being told, like, understand Pakistan through its bad politics, understand Pakistan through its troubled economy. And this is actually like a lens which, can be, good, but also just sort of neutral, right? Like, you can also understand your culture, your history through this like sort of interesting lens.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Speaking of Gen Z, one of the things I've seen pop up in mostly cities is the idea of the supper club. And I know that your book has inspired a couple of different people to cook recipes from your book for supper clubs.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're interested in for this podcast is the idea that creativity can help lead to community. Given that, I'm curious what you think about this phenomenon of supper clubs.
It's very timely because I actually just filed a piece yesterday for a Pakistani publication, Dunya, and I was talking about like the piece sort of goes into like Pakistani foods having a moment, but where are its restaurants? And in the piece, I actually talk about supper clubs, right? Because I feel there has been a lag between, Pakistani food finally getting noticed and like the restaurants actually stepping up. But I feel what's filling in the gap a little bit is supper clubs. I think that's actually allowing younger Pakistani and Pakistan like origin like chefs and creatives to kind of showcase Pakistani food in a way, in a setting that's more creative, that's a little bit elevated, without any of the overhead costs, because obviously starting a restaurant requires a lot of investment. The returns are very poor. There's a lot of hurdles in the way. And not everyone comes with that kind of capital. Not everyone, I think, is convinced of the demand just yet. Hopefully we'll change that in a few years. But I think supper clubs are like an interesting format because that allows people to experiment with, sort of like presenting their food in sort of this curated setting. I think that it's been a really positive phenomena. And I think it was one of my highlights of my book tour. It was a lovely way to close it. It allowed me to sort of meet with my existing readers and also new readers in like a much more intimate setting. And a lot of both the chef that I partnered with, Zainab, as well as nearly, I think 85%, 90% of the guests were Gen Z. So it was actually like also a cool way to sort of have an intergenerational kind of meet. It was cool.
In some ways, I think that the desire to come together and make food and share food has never really gone away, because although Gen Z, I think, is familiar with the supper club, potlucks, were a thing.
Yeah.
There's always, and as you know, in DC, I think we were in DC around the same time, there was always the potlucks where you would either bring your own thing or you would contribute like, a couple bucks or something, and somebody would be making something to share with everyone. So I think there's this kind of almost innate desire to sit around and share food like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I want to rewind a bit and mention that I had seen you start this foray into food writing pretty early on with Pakistan Eats. And I want you to talk a little bit about that journey early on. Right now, you're looking at the end of this book tour and the very successful launch of your cookbook. That's beautiful, by the way. The design of it is really lovely. And kind of looking back at the early days when you first started writing this blog and didn't know whether or not you had an audience there, what were those cues that gave you a sense that you had something different and that you could actually build a reputation in this area without having had formal culinary training?
So there was, I think one was just to get a start on it, right? And I wasn't looking for the blog to take me anywhere. I identify as like a late bloomer. I'm a big slow burn gal. I kind of knew that. I figured that out early about myself in my early 30s. And so I was like, okay, I knew from the start that it wasn't going to be like a quick win. And I kind of sort of braced myself for that. I'm like, okay, you're not going to see overnight success. And I was like, all I did was, I was like, just commit to this blog or this practice for 5 years. If you, after 5 years, you realize, okay, this really isn't going anywhere, then you can, move on with your life and like try something else. And so I gave myself that time where I was like, I didn't put pressure on myself to be like, okay, well, this isn't going anywhere. And so the first kind of 2-3 years in earnest, it was never a high traffic blog, but there was a couple of turning points. One was that the blog did allow me to build sort of an online portfolio. The writing, I guess, and the photographs were decent enough that I was able to use the blog as a way to get my first written commission, which was Taste. I think I started pitching around a year after, launching the blog. And, I'd never been published in a food magazine before. But Matt was able to sort of look at my work, look at my photography. And he was like, okay, I like your voice. I like your photographs. Pakistani food is underrepresented. And since Taste magazine was also new at the time, he was like, why don't you try being our cook in residence? And then maybe you can pitch a few pieces. So that was a good early win for me. And then the second was that I became a finalist for the Savor blog Blog Awards in 2017, and then 2018 I actually won the award. So these were some like early like wins that allowed me. I was like, okay, there clearly is a there where what I'm offering is something of value. And so I think that kind of like helped a little bit, helped me sustain sort of the momentum. And I think I was saying by my 6th year, I was able to land a book deal.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Jumping off of that, really, throughout this whole process in, your early forays in food writing, obviously with your current success with Pakistan, your current cookbook, how has this experience, changed how you see yourself? Has your perception of yourself sort of evolved during this process?
Oh, for sure, a lot. I mean, I think I used to kind of firmly identify myself as a development bureaucrat. But I think that I was like, oh, I'm like really organized. I'm like a good project manager. And I think that like the book gave me a lot of confidence about being like a self-starter, about being a creative, about being a storyteller. I think those were not things that I sort of identified myself at all. As a community builder, these were things that I'd never identified with, nothing like. So yeah, I think that way it's been like a really positive journey.
And then, also jumping off of that, how has this experience changed your relationship with Pakistan?
Oh, it's been really transformative. And I think I know a lot of kids of immigrants will, their relationship with their country, their parents' country is always shaped by their parents' sort of like depiction of it. In a way, I feel like, growing up in Islamabad, I think a lot of my relationship with my home city and with the country was preliminarily defined by my parents and my family. I was lucky enough that I went to college in Pakistan. I worked there briefly, and a lot of my development work, I was helping manage projects there. So I did have colleagues, but I think that doing food reporting and working on this book just made my relationship so much more dynamic as an overseas Pakistani, because I think even as an overseas Pakistani, I think your vision of Pakistan gets stuck during the time that you left. So I migrated like in 2008, and so working on this book up until like 2023 and even continuing to promote it, it's allowed me to have like a living relationship with the country. Like my relationship with Pakistan didn't stop in 2008. It doesn't stop just during like my little 10-day visits to my family home. It's actually just quite a very living and dynamic relationship.
No, and you do talk about that a little bit in your book. I know that you mentioned some people sort of warning you a little bit of like, okay, if you haven't been in this place, in 10 years, it's going to look a little bit different, and here's how. And I think that's a really interesting thing to touch on, that, as you're sort of growing and changing, like so is Pakistan.
So as you know, our podcast is called Two Trick Pony, which is the idea that no one has to really contain themselves to one trick. And in your book, you draw on your childhood experiences when you're talking about how your dad took you and your family to diverse places to eat, and how that kind of your love for food in this kind of very interesting contextual way is really long-standing. Like it has you have childhood memories associated with that. What would you tell our listeners about where to look for sources of their own inspiration in their pursuit of a more resilient and creative self?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I know the word mindfulness gets thrown around so much, but I think like having a quiet brain, I know because our brains are always so busy that sometimes really like a moment of inspiration or something that sticks might pass you by. And so I do think that if something is like a concept or any kind of like memory or inspiration like keeps coming up, then just taking a note of it. Like I said, I gave the blog 5 years. I didn't put that much pressure. You don't have to like feel like you need to monetize it, but maybe it's sort of engaging with it. And I think that I talk about in interviews and just generally, I like to talk about the flow state a lot. And I think paying attention to when you're doing something and you lose sense of time and when you feel that flow state, that's actually always a huge indication for me that this is good.
Yeah, there's something very unique about the flow state. It's very strange, but I do think that I agree with you that when you find yourself in the flow state, you know that you've hit upon something that you just really do very well or that you like so much,
So before we wrap up the interview, can you let people know where to follow you and your work?
Yes, of course. So I'm on Instagram at Maryam X Jillani, and then I also have a newsletter on Substack, so you can follow me on pakistaneats.substack.com, and then I also have the food blog pakistaneats.com. So yeah, you can follow me on a bunch of places.
So we'd like to close out the interview with a quick rapid fire succession set of questions. So these are questions that are meant to elicit short, very brief answers, sometimes 1 or 2 words. All right.
What is your favorite recipe in your book?
Ooh. Chicken hara masala.
You mentioned that you got really involved in kind of understand the DC restaurant scene. What is your favorite restaurant in DC?
Rose's Luxury.
That was quick.
What would be the ultimate gift to buy somebody who's into food or food writing?
Oh my God. This is really hard. I have a go-to gift, but it's not food related. It would be like a scented candle from Kishmish. And they have like a lot of, they have like some really good South Asian inspired flavors. And then my second one was going to be a moleskin notebook.
Both of those things you can use to jot notes. The candle you can use for your supper club. I think that works.
I would also say the ultimate gift to buy somebody who's into food and food writing would be your book.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
name one tool that you use that you are unreasonably emotionally attached to. And this should be related to your food writing.
Okay. It'd probably be my walk. Yeah.
No, that's a good one. Can you share a fun fact about Pakistani food?
The fun fact about Pakistani food, it's spicy, but not in the same way. So each like dish will bring a different type of because not all spice is the same. And so there is like the bright, fresh spicy, but then there's also the layered spicy. So you kind of have to be able to hang with both.
And then what is the next thing that you want to learn in your field?
I would love to do archival research. And so sort of getting more into that space is something I'd be really excited about.
That would be really cool. But yeah, that would be really interesting to see like historical aspects and maybe even just like as like food supply chains have changed, like what has that meant for what recipes look like?
Absolutely.
And finally, do you have any last words of wisdom you'd like to share?
I think it would go back to my response to the last question. Like if an idea keeps popping up, then please don't let it die and actually engage with it without putting too much pressure on yourself.
So thank you so much, Maryam, for coming on to Two Trick Pony. I know that you've had a whirlwind last couple of months moving and your book tour and, you're always traveling. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and to share with our listeners the adventure that you've had in taking your international development background and really creating a really unique voice for Pakistani food.
Thank you. No, thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Listeners, thank you so much for tuning in this week. We will be back for our next episode in 2 weeks. Also, if you haven't already, you can pick up a copy of Maryam's beautiful new cookbook, Pakistan, published by Hardy Grant, online and at your local bookstore.
If you want to get in touch with us, or if you know a Two Trick Pony who would be a great fit for the show, please let us know by email at twotrickponypodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at Two Trick Pony Podcast. Those are both with the number 2.
And if you liked this podcast, please rate us and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.